Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
If it turns out that there is a God, I don't think that he's evil. I think that the worst you can say about him is that basically he's an underachiever.
If God is so all-knowing, so all-powerful, so all-loving, why do bad things happen to good people?
I've had quite a bit of tourists lately. Marital problems, professional, you name it. This is not a frivolous request. This is I've tried to be a serious man.
What kind of divinity allows its believers to suffer?
Life is sacred? Who said so? God? Hey, if you read history, you realize that God is one of the leading causes of death.
What would God say in defense of evil?
Is evil an illusion?
Our guest is Andrew Pinsent from Oxford University.
Good, evil, and the divine plan.
Don't touch it! It's evil!
Coming up on Philosophy Talk. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're here at the studios of KALW San Francisco.
Continuing conversations that begin at Philosopher's Corner at Stanford, where Ken and I are professors of philosophy.
Today, we're asking about good, evil, and the divine plan.
Our question is this: if God knows everything, if God is all-powerful, and if God is benevolent, then why did God create a world with suffering, evil, and injustice? This is what philosophers call the problem of evil.
The first, John, the first and I think best statement I know is from Epicurus around 300 BC. He said, "If God is both able and willing to prevent evil, then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?"
Evil is a problem for religions, like Orthodox Christianity, that posit a perfect God. Such a God should be all-powerful or omnipotent, all-knowing or omniscient. And he should be benevolent, since being mean and uncaring is certainly an imperfection.
But as that quote from Epicurus shows, the problem predates Christian philosophy and theology. But the work of actually constructing serious theodicies, that started with St. Augustine.
Theodicies, Ken? That's a $10 word.
A theodicy is a defense against the problem of evil, an explanation of how there can be evil in a world created by a perfect God. Now, I know you're a big fan of St. Augustine. Do you think his theodicy actually got anywhere?
Well, this may surprise you, but I think Augustine solves, successfully, one important aspect of the problem of evil. He shows that it's at least logically possible, not contradictory, to suppose that a perfect God created a world with suffering, sin, and injustice.
But an imperfect world created by a perfect being, John, that strikes me as a little like a square circle. It makes no sense. So how does your buddy Augustine get around that?
Well, I think there's two basically connected ideas. The big picture defense and the free will defense.
The big picture defense. I remember this from my Notre Dame days. It starts with the idea that something ugly, locally, might be an essential part of a larger, more beautiful picture. A little bit of ugliness over here in this corner might make the big picture better, more aesthetically powerful.
So, by analogy, maybe a little suffering makes an essential contribution to a result that's better than we would have had without the suffering. Let's take a trivial example. When I jog, I suffer a little. But the jogging makes me healthier physically, and the suffering makes me stronger mentally. My life, with a little suffering, is a better life than it would be without.
So if we had the big picture, if we could see God's vast creation in one fell swoop, which of course we humans can't do, we'd see that what we take to be injustice and suffering is actually compensated for. It's a necessary part of the best overall possible world, as Leibniz likes to put it.
Exactly. Then there's the free will defense, which Augustine really focused on. That adds an important point. A world with freedom in it, where God lets humans make decisions, is better than one without freedom, even if those decisions sometimes lead to pain and suffering.
Okay, John, I'm willing to grant that maybe it's logically possible that a perfect God could create some world with evil in it and injustice in it. But is it really plausible that an all-perfect, all-loving God created this world, which is so suffused with evil and injustice?
Well, that's quite right. showing that something is logically possible isn't the same as showing that it's empirically plausible. But it's an important first step.
Okay, I'll grant you it's a first step, but there are so many things about our world where we just can't imagine what a loving God could have in mind. Think of the suffering of innocent children in concentration camps, or the suffering of innocent adults, for that matter. What's that got to do with perfection and free will and all that jazz?
Well, I suppose if I point out to you, Ken, that you're committing the sin of pride by supposing that you finite human, should be able to imagine what a perfect God had in mind, I suppose if I pointed that out to you, you wouldn't be that impressed.
You're exactly right. I'd be totally unmoved. But look, I'm at least willing to admit that there's a lot more to discuss here.
Such as how people of faith hold on to it, even in the face of extreme evil. Our roving philosophical reporter, Caitlin Esch, met such a person. She files this report.
During El Salvador's 12-year civil war, Sister Madeline Dorsey with the Mary Knoll nuns lived among the poor. She says she saw evil firsthand.
Yes, very much, very close up, very close up.
Sister Madeline is 95, and she's seen some things. She helped start a jungle hospital in Bolivia. She worked to integrate the first black and white hospital in Kansas City. But perhaps her most difficult assignment was in the 1980s, counseling people during El Salvador's civil war.
Innocent people, poor people, their little farms, their lands burned, taken away from them, their crops burned because they figured they were hiding behind tall sugarcane, anything to damage their lives.
Sister Madeline says there wasn't much she could do except be with people in their grief. She could no longer provide medical services. That was seen as subversive. So she lived among people who were there one day, disappeared the next. She witnessed their lives, their pain. Amidst all the suffering, Sister Madeline says there were saintly, courageous people, like Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of San Salvador. His life was depicted in the 1989 film Romero.
The farmers and peasants that you kill are your own brothers and sisters.
He was the voice of the people. He was fearless. He spoke out on their behalf. His last sermon given at the cathedral, when he addressed the lineup of soldiers with their guns against the main doors coming into the cathedral in San Salvador, he said, "Stop killing your brothers."
No soldier is obliged to obey an order contrary to the law of God.
And the next day, they took his life, as you know, one shot into the heart.
That was in March of 1980. Later that year, Sister Madeline would witness even greater evil. 4 of her fellow missionaries were raped and murdered by officers of the Salvadoran National Guard. For days after the women disappeared, no one knew what had happened to them. Then Sister Madeline got a report of a peasant who'd been forced to bury 4 women. Sister Madeline went to identify the bodies.
We got to the site just as the graves were going to be opened. It was a tragedy to see them coming out. Jean was the first brought up, and her face was partially blown away. Apparently they'd all been shot in the head, and she must have turned her face, or they destroyed it. I don't know which. We couldn't go too close, and then we fell down on our knees and prayed.
Sister Madeline thinks back on those days as a resurrection moment. On the Friday, the women were brutally killed. Saturday, they were entombed, and on Sunday, they rose. She takes comfort in that.
Yes, their battered bodies were there, and abused, definitely abused. But they were with God.
Sister Madeline says there's no question evil abounds in this world, but she does not see it as part of God's plan.
I don't think evil is ever God's plan, ever. I think we, human beings, take sides, and I'm going to say we take sides with the devil.
Sister Madeline sees all conflicts as a battle between good and evil, God versus the devil, and she's devoted her life to helping people.
I think evil in times like these has the upper hand, but that's not in God's plan. I think that's why good people remain with poor, suffering people and try to help them come through their ills or seek justice for them and peace for them.
Seek justice is exactly what Sister Madeline has tried to do. She's testified at several trials, and in 2012, a federal immigration judge ordered a retired Salvadoran general in Florida deported, so the men responsible can start answering for their sins. For Philosophy Talk, I'm Caitlin Esch.
Thank you, Caitlin, for that moving report about how people like Sister Madeline not only retain their faith, but have it deepened in the face of evil. I'm John Perry. With me is my Stanford colleague, Ken Taylor.
And today we're talking about good, evil, and the divine plan. We're joined now by Father Andrew Pinsent. He's a professor of theology and religion at the University of Oxford, where he's also research director of the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion. Father Andrew, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Yes, good morning, California. I hope you can hear me.
Oh, we can hear you fine. Father Andrew, I understand that earlier in your career you were a scientist, a physicist for that matter. How did you get from thinking about quarks and spin to thinking about God and evil?
Yes, I spent several happy years doing particle physics. In fact, I came to Stanford University at one time and saw the beautiful people of Stanford and visited the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. It's all great fun, but in the end, I found people more interesting than particles, and the problems of good and evil and theology and the meaning of life, that's a wonderful thing to spend your life involved with.
So for many would-be believers, people who would really like to believe, evil and suffering are big barriers to belief. Not seeing how this world, how could that be the creation of a perfect God? That problem blocks their faith. And I'm sure you meet many such people. What advice can you or do you give them?
Well, this is not a trivial problem, and it was recognized in the Old Testament. Of course, in the book of Job, it's all about the story of a good man suffering. So I think anyone who gives a trivial or facile answer is just inadequate. But even to begin addressing the problem, you've got to have at least two distinctions, and I'll make one little criticism of the title of your show. So the first distinction is between what you might call acceptable and unacceptable or good and bad suffering. So there's some kind of suffering that no one really has a problem with. If you're training for the Olympics, you expect to suffer. In fact, if there was no suffering involved, somehow the achievement would be taken away. And there's also a kind of suffering that everyone would accept in the case of where someone does something really evil, and let's say, like the case just being talked about just now, that Sister Madeline was talking about. You'd want the perpetrators to be punished, and that would cause suffering. In fact, a world without that would be regarded as something which is defective. So there's some suffering which is acceptable, but there's also the suffering we have problems with. And I suggest it's one of two things. Suffering that seems to undermine our flourishing or deprive us of the desires of our heart, or both. I think that's where the real issue comes in. One criticism about the title of your program, Good, Evil and the Divine Plan. I don't like the term divine plan. I'm much more prepared to believe that God constantly rewrites the plan. It's like playing chess with someone who wants you to win, and we keep making the wrong moves, and the other player keeps compensating. That seems to be the story of the Old Testament: constant human mistakes and a kind of steadily rewritten plan.
But now, in that respect, as I understand things, you would differ from Augustine, who thinks God is outside of time and space, and this idea of his interacting, and although it definitely has Old Testament credentials, doesn't seem to fit very well with that.
Well, this touches on another issue we could almost devote a whole program to, which is, can God answer prayer, can God change, and so on. In terms of contemporary philosophy, the best way I think of expressing it is God doesn't change in time, but God is not the same in all possible worlds. So there's a world in which, for example, Hannah prays for a child in the Old Testament and she gets a child, and there's a world in which she doesn't pray for a child and she doesn't get a child. So from our perspective, I think the safest way of thinking about these things is God, yes, does change and can rewrite the plan.
I think, I get that idea, but I'm still puzzled, and we're going to have to dig into this a little more deeply, well, a lot more deeply. I'm still puzzled because, a God who says, I've got this design for the universe, but I'm going to put freedom in there so that human beings can muck it up, and I'm going to have to constantly readjust it so that it works out well. I mean, jeepers, why did he make these beings, imperfect beings, who could muck up his perfect plan, and then he has to constantly be a fireman putting out fires? But we'll dig into that, okay, a little more deeply after the break.
Okay.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. Today we're asking about good, evil, and the divine plan, or non-plan. Our guest is Father Andrew Pinsent from Oxford University.
Famine, disease, war, murder, a necessary part of the best of all possible worlds? Or a convincing disproof of a benevolent God?
Disease, famine, and philosophy. When Philosophy Talk continues.
If it wasn't for bad luck, you know I wouldn't have no luck at all.
Born with bad luck, or born into a world where evil is part of God's plan? I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything
except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor, and we're questioning good, evil, and the divine plan.
Our guest is Father Andrew Pinsent from the University of Oxford.
So, Father Andrew, I'm going to grant, for the sake of argument, that a great deal of evil comes from the free choice of human beings, and that the free choice of human beings is just the price God is willing to pay. I mean, he loves us and all that sort of stuff. But look, couldn't he have created a world with plenty of freedom, but a lot less pain and suffering? I mean, as Hume said, couldn't he just occasionally intervene and drown a few despots at birth? I mean, just knock off Hitler, and do kidney stones have to hurt so much? Couldn't he have prevented them from hurting so much?
Well, it's very strange. It's a very modern kind of question. Why do bad things happen to good people, and why are things so bad? Curiously enough, in the early Middle Ages, they used to ask the opposite question: why do good things happen to good people? And this is the reasoning behind it. They used to say, well, if suffering is connected with becoming holy and good and reaching heaven one day, and if we don't have enough of that, we might not get there. So they used to really panic a little bit if they weren't suffering enough. So the question has changed over the course of time.
But that's what we'd expect, right? I mean, given your background in physics, the way you thought about physics or think about physics, the way that people at SLAC think about physics, differs a lot from the way that even Einstein thought about physics, which differed a lot from the way Newton thought. So religiously, wouldn't we have made progress, and wouldn't this modern way of putting the question be a pretty good way of putting it?
Well, one thing we accept in modern physics and modern way of looking at the world is that it's got its own kind of causation. And we think if God has created a world in which there's what we call secondary causation, in which things can cause and change outcomes, then in the sense that, yes, this is part of the price that God pays, a certain amount of disorder. There's a very interesting line in the Our Father, most famous prayer of traditional Christianity, and the line is, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So the corollary of that is that God's will is not done on earth, or not perfectly at the moment. And so with the spontaneity, voluntary action, free will, these things, if you like, muck up or produce outcomes that God would not wish to happen.
But Father, okay, I want to go back to the things you said about the medievals and before that, I guess. I mean, I can sort of understand where they're coming from. But that's if you already buy into something. If you already buy into like this life here is just a little segment, a little tiny initial segment of your true whole life. And most of your true whole life is going to be spent, if you're deserving, in union with the divine, then this little life is a little testing ground for you. And the suffering and how you bear up under the suffering is a test of whether you meet God's test. But if I'm outside and I'm trying to convince myself of this, that I should believe, that's not going to be very moving, right? Because I'm skeptical about this eternal salvation and union with God in the first place. And you say, well, but see, this suffering is just a little ticket yet you have to purchase.
Okay, But you can't have it both ways. I think the challenge against religious faith from people who don't have that faith is that somehow the religious faith is not coherent, or claims we make about God and nature of the world don't fit together. But that's that. If you're asking for a defence based on those claims, and then you have to accept the premises of those claims. So I have to be, if I'm giving a defence, I have to also be allowed to use the same sort of premises that you could use in order to criticise my position. So, from the worldview in which I have to give a defence that's coherent, then that would include other things. It includes notions like salvation, eternity, and so on.
Well, if you go back, let's go back to our analogy with relativistic physics and Newtonian physics. Now, as I understand it, which isn't very well, I'm sure, compared to you, but Newtonian physics wasn't shown to be incoherent or contradictory. By making enough special assumptions and adjustments here and there, they could account for all the phenomena Einstein came up with. But at a certain point, it just seemed to people, isn't it just going to work better overall, given the evidence, to accept this view? Now, a scientist can do both things at the same time. They can work 8 hours a day trying to make Newton's theory work, but they can also, in the evenings, think, but is really that the best theory? Now, isn't that the position, I'm speaking for myself, that a lot of believers over the years have found themselves in? Yes, I can work hard to see how this all can be made to work out, given heaven and hell and the devil, I think, has to come into it. But then the question remains, is that really the best overall theory, given the evidence I've got?
Yeah, there's a slight kind of disanalogy between the two cases, because in the case of a model of physics, a model for the quantitative behavior of the world, the measurement of the world, you can put that to one side. It's or try out different models and so on. Issues of God and faith, they go a lot deeper. One's whole life, in a sense, can be founded on these things. So it's a little bit different. It's not so easy to sort of take those things and sort of set into one side and put something else in place and so on. It's a harder task, I think.
Father, I want to go back to, again, I think I understand what you were saying to me earlier, but I want to try something out. Okay, I kind of grant that what people call the logical problem of evil, is it logically possible for a loving, benevolent God to create a universe suffused with suffering and evil and injustice and all that? I kind of grant that you can solve that by having, like, for example, this view that, well, our life here is just a little tiny sojourn. It's like the little testing ground, but it doesn't really matter. I kind of grant that that's logically coherent, but I still wonder, gosh, why does God have to do that? And why should I believe about a God who says, well, I'm going to put you to the... I had a theologian once tell me on this air, I said to that theologian, I said, what should a Jew who endures Hitler's concentration camp and holds up and doesn't despair, and when he meets his maker, she meets his maker, what should that... And says, God, why did you do that? And God, what is that person supposed to say when he meets... And that theologian, Sir Richard Swinburne, said to me, he's supposed to say, thank you, God. Thank you, God, for giving me the opportunity to show you what I've made of, to hold up well under the most intense pressure. Thank you, God.
Okay, can I just the way it's being phrased, I don't quite agree with.
Okay.
So when you talk about a testing ground, it sounds like a sort of a quality assurance production line for a silicon chip or something. And that's not how Christians would regard this life. C.S. Lewis expressed it, I think, very well. He said, "In this life we write the title page of what we are to be in eternity," and God is seeing what kind of eternity we want to have, if you like. So that's a slightly different way of thinking about it. But your example of the Jew in the concentration camp and what he would say to God is a very interesting case. In fact, Victor Klemperer. Now, Victor Klemperer suffered appallingly under the Nazis, and he lost his academic position, I think, in 1935. and he felt he'd been deprived of the chance to really flourish. He wanted to write a great academic book. But secretly, during the time of the Nazi regime, he kept a diary. And that diary has become one of the most important documents now of the Nazi era. He did actually achieve the desire of his heart to write a great academic book, but not quite the way he expected. So even though a person might not be aware of it at the time, that doesn't necessarily mean that that person will not be able to flourish eventually and even achieve the desires of his or her heart.
That's a deep and penetrating answer. I want to go back a little bit, though, to the analogy I gave you before. Let's shift to philosophy. As a philosopher, I'm a compatibilist. I work, it's important to me that compatibilism is true. I try to work out that's for our listeners. That's a view about free will and determinism, or free will and God's knowledge. But it's not an existential problem for me. I don't really think it's important that I really find out the truth of that. I just want to do my best with the theory that I came up with. But it seems to me, insofar as you're right, there's a disanalogy between the physicist trying to decide between relativity theory, his defending Newton, his day job, and whether he should believe relativity theory. And the believer, I think there is a disanalogy, but I think it goes the other way from what you say. I mean, I can't put aside the question of whether I can, really make sense of the beliefs I'm basing my whole life on. So it seems to me that I appreciate that lots of people like Sister Madeline, people who face evil in a way I haven't, find their faith deepened, but I don't. I'd like to figure, and how can I ignore that problem?
Yeah, it's interesting that the whole problem of suffering can be approached from an atheistic perspective and a theistic perspective, and it's a very, very different way of doing it. The atheist sees a logical problem. The theist just wants to know why. It's not a question of doubting God's existence. He wants to know why this is happening. That's the Book of Job in the Old Testament. Interestingly, the theist is not. You don't necessarily get to the end of the reasoning and disbelieve God, but you may not yet get an answer to the divine plan. So it's not always. It's a problem that can be addressed from very different perspectives, and it's not necessarily a game changer for belief in God.
Well, true, but there's the atheist, there's the theist, and then there's the teenager in all of us, the one who hasn't made up his mind, and that's the one that I think the problem of evil is the big problem for.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about good, evil, and the divine plan with Father Andrew Pinsent from Oxford University. We'd love to know what you think, and we have Peter from San Francisco on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Peter.
Yes, good morning. I wonder if the good Father could explain how a loving God could require a man to sacrifice his son to show his belief in God or whatever.
Our caller is talking probably about Abraham, who was told by God that he had to sacrifice Isaac, and then Isaac was given a last-minute reprieve. And this is a topic that Kierkegaard wrote long and to some people quite convincingly.
Well,
about.
Eloquently, I'm not sure convincingly, but the problem, God tells Abraham, go and sacrifice your son. Kierkegaard says this is a great paradox. The ethical name for what God asked of Abraham is murder your son.
Of course, the big picture to start with, of course, the son Isaac survives, and it's very easy to look back on those things and think, gosh, that's all very primitive. We actually do, I would say, sacrifice children today to expediency and other things, but that's another big issue. With the case of Abraham, there's a bigger picture of his whole life. So Abraham is called the father of faith, but actually he keeps messing up. So when he's asked to leave his land and his family, he brings Lot with him, and that turns out to be a bit of a disaster. And then he appoints a steward instead of having a son, and then he has a son by a slave girl instead of by his wife. And all the time he keeps hedging his bets. Now, the test of Abraham can be interpreted as Abraham being asked, do you trust God? Do you trust that Isaac will survive and flourish and become the father of a great people, even though it seems naturally impossible? And Abraham has trusted God in the past when it suited him, and now it doesn't suit him. So it's a question of whether he's going to put his trust completely in God in the particular circumstance of that very unusual life.
And Father, in contradiction, this is how Kierkegaard takes it, in contradiction to everything that reason and ethics and the universal, as Kierkegaard puts it, right? Everything that ethical life requires of us, God says, I'm going to ask you to suspend that, and you're supposed to do it, and that Abraham somehow is able to do it, right, he's supposed to be the great exemplar of faith. Do you take faith to be as irrational as Kierkegaard takes it to be? He takes it to be utterly irrational.
No, I do not. But to understand Abraham's decision, you have to understand Abraham's life, and he's already sacrificed one son. He drove his other son out into the wilderness. That was the Ishmael, the son of Hagar. But that suited him, and Abraham's being asked to resolve a conflict in his own heart. And yes, it looks as if Isaac can't survive. Abraham is assured, however, by God that he will survive and become the father of great people. So it's a kind of supernatural trust. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. And Abraham is promised, of course, his descendants will be more than the stars of heaven. And that is actually what happened.
Okay, so look, the Kierkegaardian view of faith is as irrational, and we have to take this leap of faith in the face of, doubt and anguish and despair. We can get to what he calls resignation, but reason can get us to resignation, but it can't get us all the way to faith. Now, you might think that the problem of evil is something that we can never rationally get our head around, and that we just have to take this leap of faith. Believe that God has a plan. You can never have any evidence for the plan, but just believe. Is that how you want us to approach it?
Well, plan, remember, isn't quite the right word.
Has a sort of plan. Has a sort of combat. Has a sort of combat strategy.
Yeah.
Constantly rewritten plan.
Yeah. Kind of like my GPS, who keeps giving me good directions, and I screw it up, and it very calmly comes back and says, please make a U-turn.
Nice.
But I'm asking you whether you think we need to take a leap of faith, or a leap of faith in the Kierkegaardian way that takes us beyond reason, or can reason satisfy itself that, okay, I can do this. I can believe in the face of this.
Well, it's the kind of faith is not it's not about belief in an everyday sense. It's the root of what we call a second person relationship with God, an I-thou relationship with God. And getting close to God is difficult. Allowing God to come close to us is difficult. The crucible of suffering, history suggests, is often the way it happens. And here's an example that Max Hastings used in one of his accounts of the Second World War. So there's a Red Army soldier who's never been taught how to pray. And when she comes under fire from the guns of the Nazi armies, suddenly she starts making up prayers. So from God's point of view, that's actually a good outcome. What does it take to get close to us? Sometimes it's only crisis, the crucible.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about good, evil, and the divine plan with Father Andrew Pinsent from the University of Oxford.
In our next segment, we'll get further into whether the abstract ruminations of philosophers can provide actual comfort in the face of real pain and suffering.
Do you think God made the right choice in giving humans freedom? Or would you rather be more constrained, but in a happier, less suffer-infused world? When Philosophy Talk continues.
Watch your happy home.
What kind of divinity lets its believers suffer evil? The topic is good, evil, and the divine plan, or at any rate, interactive strategy. I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything
except your intelligence. Our guest is Father Andrew Pinsent from the University of Oxford, and we've got a caller on the line, Gina from Berkeley. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Gina.
Hi, thanks for having me. I have a question for Father Andrew. My background is also in physics and astrophysics, actually. My question is about evil towards children in particular who are completely innocent. In the story of Abraham and Isaac, I actually find Ishmael and his mother Hagar the most sympathetic, and I also think often of Ivan Karamazov, who says no matter how just and good God is, how can he accept a God who allows a child to suffer even for one moment? And so maybe you could sort of pull those together, and I'll take that off air. Thank you.
Father Andrew, were you able to hear that question?
Yes, I did.
Okay,
Very good question. Thank you. I wish I could give such a succinct answer. I think it will be. There's a problem with debating all these things in the abstract. It can sound cold and heartless, and I think the most convincing kind of response is, if there is a response to these kinds of problems, is the particular stories, and we have to do what philosophers do quite a lot, that they tend to be a bit guilty about. We have to tell stories, and with in the case of Christian history, it's the stories of the saints, and even the child saints who suffer. In the end, what's extraordinary is this kind of flourishing that they have even long after their death. And the fact that, insofar as we're able to tell these things, they often get the desires of their hearts. Now, here's an example of a saint I'm very fond of. It's Saint Therese of Lisieux. And she wasn't exactly a child, but she was very young when she died. She died at, young by modern standards, she died at 24 of tuberculosis, and she wanted to be a missionary. She never left her convent, and she wrote one exercise book. This would seem to be a pretty stunted life and a bit of a failure. Now, when I came back to Oxford University in 2009, a small part of her bones was visiting Oxford, and we had thousands of people coming to pray in the church where the bones were. And the police sort of holding back the crowds and so on. And this is amazing. This woman has become a successful missionary in the world. She just happens to be dead. But she got the desires of her heart, but not always not perhaps in the way that she expected. So the big picture does matter, but it's got to be a concrete big picture. It's got to be in particular stories, particular lives that we know of. Perhaps if I could give one other example, because this touches me. So in the year 2000, I was a priest training in Rome, and I had the privilege of serving the Mass for Thomas More. He was declared the patron saint of politicians. And I was given the privilege of carrying, yes.
Was that a good thing for him?
Yes, along with lawyers, actually. So this is good. They got a powerful saint there. So I carried the cross into St. Peter's Square. On my left, there were two figures I recognized from the news. One was Madeleine Albright, and the other was Mikhail Gorbachev. And I was amazed. I thought the last General Secretary of the Soviet Union came to a Mass to honor Thomas More as patron saint of politicians. And but when More died, he would have seemed to be on his own, a complete failure. He didn't seem to get everything. He died in he was locked in the tower. Most of his friends deserted him, and he had his head cut off. So, the big picture does matter, and it's what's amazing is the fruitfulness of some of these lives in the long term.
Well, Father, I'm loving talking to you. You think of things quite differently from me, and rather than object or try to come to agreement, I want to spend a minute exploring some issues that really interest me.
Sure.
Going back to Augustine and free will. Now, Augustine, I mean, based on my unscholarly and inept reading, seems to feel like God came to think he'd made a mistake. He gave Adam a kind of free will that didn't work out. And then after Adam, he gave us some lesser kind of free will. If Adam wasn't going to obey God, our bodies weren't going to obey our minds. That's the way some people put it. Do you think Augustine was right about that, or do I have Augustine right? Do we have a kind of a deficient kind of free will, which wasn't what God really had in mind when he created the whole place?
That's a very good point. Just to clarify this issue of freedom, it's very tempting to think that freedom is sort of something we add on to what we are as human beings. That wouldn't be the way that Thomas Aquinas, for example, thinks of it. If God takes away our freedom, we just cease to be. We wouldn't be the kinds of beings that we are if we weren't causes of our own action. So. So it's not an optional extra for what it is to be a human being. It's certainly not an optional extra if we're to be loving beings, because without freedom you can't love. It would just be a caricature. But in the case of Augustine, what he's picking up on is the fact as we get closer to God, we actually gain a kind of freedom over ourselves as well. There's a kind of harmony. So. As we go into darkness, if you were, of sin or vice, we begin to become internally disordered. We both love and hate at the same time the thing we're addicted to. So I think that's what he's picking up on.
But Father, Augustine I mean, but the problem with that is that the first humans, by the story, were as close to God as one could be. And they still did this thing that
it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But I want to ask you about something else. Look, I love the stories. I love the inspiring stories. And I lived this. I tried to believe for a long time, and I gave it up. And I once said to my father, we were talking about the problem of evil, and he said, "Haven't you ever read Job's son?" I said, "Yeah, I've read Job." And, well, you've got all these questions, but I'm going to say to you what God said to Job. Basically, he put it in very colorful language. Where the heck were you? When I created this vast thing, dude? Like, how dare you? But I just don't. A God who says.
That's a sin of pride argument.
Yes, I know. A God who says, trust me, don't question me. I've got a huge comprehensive plan, although I don't really have a huge comprehensive plan by your lights, because I put Hitler in there, and I know he's going to muck things up, but I'm going to make the adjustments. But too late to save you from his crematorium. I mean, how am I supposed to... I just can't get my head around such a God. It's worse than Dostoevsky has one of the Karamazov brothers. It's much worse. It's not just it's generations and generations of human suffering unredeemed. Because look, Jesus doesn't come along until pretty late in human history, right? And you can't get redeemed from this suffering unless you take the one way. So all this unredeemed human suffering, God created this for what reason? Come on, make me feel that there's that he's not just giving me the finger and saying, "Don't dare you question me, boy," because that's what the Job story seems to me to say.
Well, it's the story of Job. It's there's a subtlety with language. When God says, "Where are you?" That's actually the very similar question he asked to Adam in the story of the Garden of Eden. Because the very first question after the fall is, "Where are you?" Which is a very funny question for God to ask, because presumably God can't lose anything. So what's going on here? And the way I would interpret it is it's a kind of freezing over of the heart. The heart is no longer responsive to God. There's an image I've sometimes used. It's not careful not to be misinterpreted, but it's a kind of a spiritual autism. It's like as if we're put into a state where we don't respond properly to God spiritually. And breaking through to that is hard, and God may permit a certain amount of suffering to break that through, to melt our hearts. So in the story of Job, it doesn't look as if there's an answer, but what's interesting at the beginning of the book, he's really a kind of religious prig, if I put it like that. So he starts off doing all his religious duties right, and God blesses him. I'll do this for God, God will do this for me. But by the end of the book, it's he says, I want to see the face of God. I want to love with God the things that God loves. It's actually and actually he gets new children. His children have died at the beginning of the book. He gets new children at the end of the book.
But Father, let me interrupt you. I really want to challenge you a little bit here.
Okay, sure.
Because I didn't get to do this to priest at Notre Dame.
Go ahead.
But look, I suppose I am deeply sympathetic to humanity, and I survey the vast amount of human suffering over the whole human adventure. It's an immeasurable amount of suffering, as Nietzsche puts it. And if one could endure this, he says, you would have the humanity of a God. But the question is, can I endure it? I open my heart to humanity and its suffering. Okay, and I want to redeem that suffering. You say, oh, God, in the end, but this plan that I can't comprehend, that is allowed to be interrupted by the Hitlers, right? And then God's going to make some adjustments sometime. How am I supposed to get into an I-thou relationship with that God? And especially if he won't reveal his strategy, his plan, and all that stuff.
Well, coming back to what I said at the beginning, the crucial thing is, does all the suffering that comes our way, does it ultimately undermine our flourishing? Does it deprive us of the desires of our heart, or both? And what I suggest, in many cases we just don't know, because we don't know the full story of a human life from the inside, each individual human life. In some of the interesting stories, and that we do know of, or have some insights into, which for me would be some of the stories of the heroic saints, what's interesting is that despite the suffering, there is this flourishing, and they fulfill the desires of their hearts, not always in a way that they expect. So that gives me hope.
Yeah. The one last thought about the desires of the heart. Now, I remember reading at Notre Dame, the Divine Comedy, and in the Inferno, it says something at the gates of hell, this place is is forged
Sacred
by
love.
divine love or something
Love.
like that.
That's it, yes, yes.
And I struggled to understand what that could possibly mean. But my teacher said it meant God so loves us that He will give us what we most desire, and if we most desire eternal damnation, He's giving us that out of love. I don't get that.
Well, people. I guess putting it slightly differently, people who don't want God will not be forced to spend eternity with Him. I think that's partly what Dante is saying. What's interesting is not everyone suffers in hell.
But to get back to a question Ken raised,
but in the case of limbo, they're not actually suffering.
But they're not getting their heart's desire either, are they? I mean, a lot of good people that before Jesus came along are not going to make it.
Actually, that's not quite true. Well, at least not in mainstream Christianity. When there are several verses where Jesus talks about those who've come before Him being in the kingdom of heaven, including Moses and Elijah, for example. So certainly not the gates are not sort of closed before then. Or
right.
They can be open.
The upright pagans and all that are in purgatory or something. Isn't that right?
In Dante's vision, some of them were in limbo. A few of them made it to heaven.
But a bunch of those, the people that came before Jesus, are just in the worst place, aren't they? Because they were debauchers and all this sort of stuff. But they weren't offered the one true way out, which is another thing that really bothers me about God. Why didn't He? I just don't get it.
Yeah, I think this is actually the issue I find most challenging. So, does everyone get the same chance? The traditional teaching of Christianity is that everyone has sufficient grace for salvation. But whether it's so easy living in, say, an Aztec environment where they sacrifice people by throwing down pyramids is it's not so easy to answer.
On that difficult note, Father Andrew, I'm going to thank you for joining us. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much.
Our guest has been Father Andrew Pinsent. He's a professor of theology and religion at the University of Oxford. He's the research director of the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion. So, John, this is deep, hard, difficult stuff. What are you thinking today?
I'm thinking, as I often think at the end of our programs, that it's a big world with minds of very different sorts approaching the same problems in very different ways. And I'm humbled by the intelligence of people who believe things that seem to me completely unlikely.
Yeah, completely unlikely. Well, that's how completely unlikely. You didn't say completely irrational. I mean, I do think you could find a way to have a kind of coherent system of belief, a sort of logically coherent system of belief. You got to include the afterlife and all that sort of stuff. But whether it's plausible, that question we started out with, I still don't get my head around that. But you know what, John? This conversation continues on our blog, theblog.philosophytalk.org, where our motto is cogito ergo blogo. I think, therefore I blog. You can also follow our tweets on Twitter, and you can find out more by visiting our very, very active Facebook page.
Now we get the fastest word on good and evil from Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Ian Scholes. Not being a church-going man, issues of theodicy don't often occur to me. The question, if God exists, why is there evil, doesn't really resonate. There are many possible answers, after all. God doesn't like us. God has a sick sense of humor. God doesn't care about us one way or the other. God cares about us, but his attention wanders, kind of like owning rabbits or an ant farm. God is not the nice person he says he is. Of course, I'm not thinking about great evils. I'm thinking of, lying on your job application, looking up the answer when you're doing the crossword, card counting in Vegas, telling your kid there's a Santa Claus, and so forth. These do not require the presence of guilt. Other evil actions may require guilt, though many of these are debatable. I mean, running a red light, is that evil? It could be, I guess, if you hit somebody and run away. Is cheating on your spouse evil? Well, what if your spouse was the result of a forced marriage, and the person you're cheating with is the person of your dreams? Is gossip evil? Taking drugs to win a game? Evil can be relative. Meat eating, for instance, wearing leather, driving cars, voting for Obama, joining the Tea Party. There's always some moralistic tongue clucker out there to tell you that eating chicken is wrong or that owning a machine gun is a God-given right. As for the big-ticket evils out there, like serial killing or mass murder, don't most of them require the presence of some belief? The belief that Jews are holding back Germany, for example, or that false consciousness is keeping communism from transforming the planet, or that God wants you to decapitate brunettes. Those who believe in a merciful God have a hard time reconciling that with Charles Manson or Hitler. Not being a believer, I'm more bothered by the existence of evil than the ambiguity of a ubiquitous good. Besides, there are many gods out there, the God of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, but also the dead gods of ancient Greece and Scandinavia, the gods of Hinduism, Krishna, and H.P. Lovecraft. In Cthulhu's world, I can say with confidence, humans don't really matter. At any rate, I would suggest that evil, by and large, is a human province, and God doesn't really enter into it, except as an excuse to commit it, or a reason not to. But if you're going to believe in an all-powerful God, infinite, merciful, the whole 9 yards, there are other troublesome mortal matters. Why do we have disasters, floods, earthquakes, or plagues? Why do we get sick in the first place? Why do we suffer? Why do we die? Why do we know enough even to ask these questions? Why do we have bodies? Why do we have time? Can't we just bask in God's eternal presence and say bye-bye to this corrupt mortal flesh? I mean, come on. Failing that, why isn't everything puppies and sunshine and true love and chocolate? Riddle me that, oh wise ones. I'll be over here in the corner cheating on my income tax. I gotta go.
The Wisdom of the Ages, in a nutshell, from Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of Ben Manila Productions and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University. Copyright 2013.
Our executive producer is David Demarest.
The program is produced by Devin Strolovich. Laura McGuire is our director of research.
Thanks also to Chris Hoff, Merle Kessler, Dave Millar, Jimmy Tobin, Tran, Carola Kreitmar, and Mark Stone.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from the Templeton Foundation and also from various groups at Stanford University, the Friends of Philosophy Talk,
and the members of KALW San Francisco, where our program originates.
The views expressed or misexpressed on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
Not even when they're true and reasonable. The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org.
I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.